Pop Redux, and so we have a couple of talks that we're given at PixelPop. We're going to start with Jillian and her talk, and then we have Ben Cook, and then finally we have Adam Coster. So without further ado, let's get going.
Woo! Well, thanks for coming. So my talk today is about failure and the artist. And the reason I'm bringing this up in a talk is because it's something I feel isn't spoken about very frequently, at least in the context of art. So before we get started, I'll just do a quick introduction. I'm Jillian Stiles. I'm an illustrator at Graphite Lab, and I have worked there for near 4 years now. I also do freelance illustration by night, and we shall be friends. Yay! So I just want to get out of the way before I get into the nitty-gritty of my talk, kind of what to be expecting. I'm not here to necessarily give you a TED Talk, motivational 5 steps to feeling great about everything you've ever sucked at kind of talk. And I'm also not here to let you feel that you can't feel terrible about any time that you failed about something, because that's absolutely crucial to going through failure and being let down by stuff. I'm here to go over that failure is normal, and it is something we all go through, and it is something you will face whether you are just starting at something or you are in the prime of your career, so get used to sucking at everything. So why would I talk about this? This is not necessarily the most uplifting conversation. There's a whole list of things. But the first one I want to go over is because no one wants to talk about it. It's embarrassing, it's awkward, it's just not a great conversation starter, it's not something you want people to remember you by. And going off of the embarrassment, it's embarrassing until it isn't. Usually failure, when it's presented to people, it's within the context of success, right? So you hear a great keynote speaker that has all sorts of years of successes and a business started and all this great stuff, and they can kind of cheerily and lovingly talk about the times they slept on the couch, or the time that they lost all the money, or the time that they just didn't succeed at something, because they have this cool, shiny accomplishment to sit next to it. So that, in turn, kind of makes failure a little bit more bitter if you're not necessarily at that success part yet. We could all learn to be a little bit kinder to ourselves. Talking about it will be great for the community, for yourself. If you understand that this is just something that is normal, you're not going to be as hard on yourself when it happens. You'll learn how to just pick everything up and just move forward with that. Reducing success aggro. You see frequently with a lot of creative work, at least, people that are within the community, friends of yours, colleagues that obtain a lot of success with something, whether it's a project they did really well on, or maybe they're really popular on Twitter and they have a great following, and sometimes you get that tinge of like, man, like that person is just doing so much great stuff and I kind of hate them for it. Let's kind of bring that down a little bit. I think if we talk about the stuff that happens before that success more openly and what we all go through, that will alleviate some of that. Also to emphasize that you are not alone. This happens to everybody, and just to shout it for the people in the back, you are not alone. This happens to everybody. And we should also reassess what the definition of failure means. So I'm gonna give you the deets about all sorts of stuff. Going over different definitions of failure, different things within the context of failure that impact a lot of creatives. The biggest one is imposter syndrome, like I'm feeling right now. It's basically the feeling that you are not qualified to be somewhere, or maybe you don't have enough credentials to do something. If you've seen a job that pops up and you're like, oh man, I don't have 14 years experience to do this thing, I shouldn't apply to it. Everybody's felt that way, everybody has done that. Social media is another aggregator of just bad feels sometimes. If you're already in a feedback loop, or maybe something's not going too great in your life right now, it kind of is a bit of a blow to go online, to Twitter, to anything else, and see what you see as a success after success when you're not actually seeing everything in between. Work interruptions. If you're a freelancer, this is extra rough. If maybe you haven't had work for a couple of months, maybe it's just a slow season, maybe a promo that you sent out didn't hit art directors the way you thought. And that feels extra rough, and that can really make you feel like you haven't been succeeding with your work, even though that's just a normal process. Isolation is another thing. Artists tend to work on their own. We like to sit at computers and stare at screens, and we like to not talk to people while we work on projects. And then you feel alone, and you feel like you have nobody else to connect to. And that's another thing that ends up just exasperating any feelings. Time versus expectation. You see this a lot with freelancers, especially people that are just starting their freelance or maybe just starting up a business. Takes time to do these things. Any successful freelancer that I know, it's taken at least 8 to 10 years of investment into their own business, into their own art, into their own work to even get a consistent workflow going. And when you graduate and you have all these expectations, sometimes it's a real bitter pill to swallow when you're not immediately getting that satisfaction right off the bat. And then, good old-fashioned rejection. Whether it's a prom date or a business loan, both the same thing. They're both all sorts of reasons that rejection could fall under that will just kind of stack on top of all these other things. So who is impacted by this specifically? Who can this be applied to? Who should we watch out for in the community and give extra hugs to? One of the biggest ones, as I said before, is recent graduates. You're totally going off the motivation of graduation. You just stepped out of this great environment with teachers and faculty members and supportive classmates, and just you're in a studio and everything's great and you can just work all night. And then you don't have a schedule. You're alone, you don't have the connections you had, you aren't working at the same pace you were, and you suddenly just have to adapt to not having everything laid out for you. And that's a lot for people to handle. And so many times, myself, classmates, anybody that I've seen go through like an art program specifically of any capacity always has that blues after at least a year after they graduate, where they feel like they suck at everything, they haven't, they're not the president of Nintendo yet, and so they're just not accomplishing anything or doing anything good. And then it only gets even worse once they get the 6-month loan notification that you have a couple months to start paying up or they'll take your legs. And that only makes things a little bit worse. Like I said before, starting freelance, this kind of ties into recent graduates, but it can also happen if you're doing a career switch or something. It's difficult to kind of wade through the starting elements of a business, whether you have to make a lot of financial risks and investments that might not pay off right away. Sometimes you're just not going to get good feedback on your art that you send out, and that can be a real big blow. And another is just switching career. There's a handful of people I know even in the community that have switched from other careers into game development or other careers into art. And that can be even more isolating, especially if you feel kind of this creeping burden behind you that you didn't go to art school and you don't have all these other things that everybody else started with. And that can really build up into anxiety. And then everybody else, literally everybody, all the way up to top professionals that have been in the industry, whether it's art, illustration, anything. Everybody feels all of these kind of elements of failure within their career. So show me the receipts. Can't talk about failure and sharing failure without sharing my failures. So there's a whole plethora of things that I've just sucked at and I have failed at and I have cried in showers over and just been sad all the time. I've sent out postcards. I spent $1,000 on a postcard campaign and got nothing back. That's happened to me more than once, and it's just part of business. You just have to keep going, and it really sucks to not get feedback on stuff. I have been rejected from jobs. I've been rejected from annuals. You have to pay to get into those too, so that burns a little bit more. Gallery shows, contests. I've made such an incredible amount of bad art and have had to deal with its existence. Not having enough time to work on art and also having too much time to work on art. I feel bad because I have free time and I feel bad because I don't have free time. So there's all sorts of things that impact all sorts of artists all the time, and these are things that you don't see kind of these failures in between their successes toward the end. And I kind of want to showcase this because sometimes I get comments where it's like, oh, I've been seeing you've posted a couple things lately or you've done this and that, and it's like there's all this in between that. Like there's no waking up and you have like a amazing success every single day. It's a process. So what now that we've talked about all these exciting, heartwarming things? I want to talk about kind of the context first of failure. I think a lot of times failure is framed as a finish line when it's part of a larger part of iteration and growth. Particularly, people kind of view it as this little sprout that's growing, and all of a sudden it just gets cut off. When you fail, there's just scissors that just chop this little sprout away and it's nothing. Whereas I view it more as a little flower that has grown, and maybe one branch of it just didn't happen to bloom. It doesn't mean the rest of the plant needs to be thrown out or that the rest of the plant got cut off. There's plenty of growth and iteration to be made to grow into something better. So also, it's okay to have emotions. Going back to my first slide, I want to lay out that it's okay to feel bad about not succeeding at stuff. Sometimes you're not going to get that job, or you're not going to produce the piece that you thought you were going to. And that sucks. Sometimes you just got to have a good shower cry and then get out and just continue forward. It's part of the process of acknowledging it, figuring out what you did wrong, and moving forward. And I also want to emphasize that suffering is not creativity. It's not charming or endearing to not take care of yourself, and it's not charming or endearing to suffer through mental anguish or physical anguish. Feed yourself, clothe yourself, take care of yourself. I know too many creatives that get in this habit of oh, well, if I just don't eat for 3 weeks and just yell at the top of my lungs, I'll produce the most amazing art. That's not, no. You need to take care of yourself, and if you are in a rut with stuff, you need to take a step back, and it's okay to not make art for a while. It's okay to just reassess what's going on and make sure you're in a healthy spot to make art again. With any cases of failure, instead of necessarily being so downtrodden with it, you can kind of question what about the failure can work for you. Go back and reassess, what was it that I did that maybe didn't work out this time? In the case of the postcards, for example, it really was a blow to not get any response to that, but then I kind of stepped back and realized, you know what, maybe I just didn't target my art directors correctly. And I didn't. I sent out an art piece that wasn't efficient for the people that I was trying to target. I was sending out a piece that was for one sort of publication media, and I'm sending it to a whole plethora of art directors that really couldn't have done anything with it, even if they wanted to. So I was able to then reassert my postcard setup and then just mail it back out, and I ended up getting responses on the next one because I actually took the time to reevaluate what I did wrong from the first round. Also, another thing that I think is important is assessing your definition of success and comparing that to why you might feel you're failing. Going back to kind of the social media loop and a bunch of other things, especially with artists, it's really easy to get wrapped up in what other people are viewing as a successful career or a successful life, whether it's, hey, I'm not living in this area, or hey, I don't have this cool house, or hey, I don't have these things, or hey, I'm not going or speaking at this conference, or hey, I'm not doing this stuff. Maybe that's not as important to you as you think it is, and maybe you're just kind of getting wrapped up in a bunch of things that you never really cared about to begin with. It's just something to consider, when you find yourself getting overwhelmed with what's going on around you. Maybe that possibly it's not something that you ever should have gotten stressed out over to begin with. The other is community. We fortunately have a really wonderful community here, but it's something really important, going back to artists being kind of isolated on their own. It's really important to reach out and make sure that you're talking to people and that you're getting feedback and that you're able to, show what's going on with your work, and also, again, talk about your failure. Maybe your project is really sucking right now and you just need to go tell someone about it and be like, hey, been working for the past 3 months on this thing and nothing has worked. Please let me cry on your couch. That needs to happen sometimes, so that's totally good too. And then, very importantly, be kind to yourself. I feel sometimes the generic trope of the artist being the harshest critic to themselves. It's okay to have standards and have goals and stuff, but sometimes you really need to kind of just step back and acknowledge that maybe what you thought was terrible really isn't as bad as it was. Maybe you don't need to lament over that piece for 4 or 5 days. Maybe that game mechanic you were really flustered over really wasn't as awful as you just assumed it was. just be kind, because you're not going to be able to see the, you know, the forest, essentially, if you're not able to give yourself space to actually think. And that's all. Thank you for listening to me talk about all this good stuff. Yay!
Is everyone in the back here okay? Yes.
Are you ready? Are you good here?
We're going to do question break.
Yeah. Oh yeah, any questions we're going to do at the end, or we're going to have like time for networking stuff afterwards, so you can just go up to people and ask some questions.
Hey guys, I'm Ben Cook. I'm the artist, designer, developer with Bred Rhino. And I want to talk to you guys about contrasting game design, which is something that's very important to me for designing games. I've got 2 games I've published. First one was All the Bad Parts, which came out on Xbox 360, and it was kind of a brawler, and it was kind of meh. And my most recent one is Last Ditch Goodnight, which just came out on Steam and PS4, and it's kind of a metroidvania. I learned a lot between those two. I kind of refined how I approach building game worlds, and that's really what I want to talk about. Because I think there's kind of a secret to designing games that a lot of people don't talk about or don't share with you, or everyone kind of keeps it as a secret. And that's, I don't know where the magic comes from, and I'm terrified that one day I'll wake up and it will all be gone. I'll end up alone, living in my brother's basement with his trains. No one can sit down and design a whole game from the very beginning. But we kind of go into game design like that. We think that we need to be able to have the whole game in our head. We just sit down and make the whole game. It just doesn't work that way. And it's because game design eludes planning. If it was a blueprint, it would be making a house on quicksand. Step 1, have an idea, probably one no one has ever had before. Step 2, make that idea a reality. Step 3, realize the reality wasn't very fun, so now you have to add the fun. Step 4, have lots more ideas. And I see a lot of people get really frustrated at that step 4, have lots more ideas. I already had enough ideas, I'm done. I want to move on with my life. And we, like, you know, this didn't work. This game doesn't go anywhere. This is not a real game. You know, it's all this stuff that we get frustrated with. And so I needed some tools in my own toolbox to help me overcome those problems, those mental hurdles. And really, All the Bad Parts, my first game on 360, it didn't really have design. You walked around hitting things for a while, and then you talked to people for a while. And that was kind of the game. So really, I needed to come up with an approach for game design. And anytime I think about game design, I like to start with Juice, because it's just a very tangible place to start for thinking about game design. Juice is that little stuff that makes the game feel good to interact with. It's the squishy stuff. Faster attacks, less enemy health, more enemies, attack flashes, less accuracy, impact effects, explosions, time dilation, screen shake. It's all these little things that just happen instantly when you interact with the game. And it feels good. And this was kind of the list I came up with while I was working on Last Ditch Goodnight. And then I came across 2 near the end that felt bigger than those other ones. And that was permanence. Spent bullets, dead bodies, things that kind of linger in the world. And for me, Last Ditch Goodnight, I had it that if you cleared a room and you came back to the room, it was then empty. The problem was then, later on in the game, you'd come back to these rooms and the whole mansion just felt completely empty, and it made it feel like not a world. It kind of lost that sense of this is a real place you're visiting. And so I really, took this to heart. I would spawn enemies as soon as you re-entered the room, and now if you'd already killed them, I just immediately murder them as soon as you walk in the room. Which is really fun because there's a couple that explode, so if you just walk in the room, every once in a while you just hear explosions in the distance. But now when you're walking around the world, it feels like it's populated with dead bodies. And the importance of this is that you want to be able to see this change in the world. And I talk about defeating an enemy, but it's a spilled glass of water. It's smoldering resentment on some character you talked to before. Being able to revisit a place and then see that you made a lasting impact to that place really helps the player have this sense of accomplishment. But it also builds a more believable, dynamic world. Because we have 2 points. We have the world before you hit someone over the head with the lead pipe and the world after you hit someone over the head with the lead pipe. And we know what connects those 2 points. And that's really what was important to me when I was thinking about contrast. So when I say contrast, a state of being strikingly different from something else, typically something in juxtaposition or close association. And it can be used to create a robust world story experience, avoid gameplay fatigue, create more memorable games. And that's really what I wanted to do. I wanted to find something that I could think about when I'm designing a game that will help steer me toward these 3 big goals. So the first level of contrast is contrast level 1, which is the environment. So this is kind of the low-hanging fruit. And most of us do this when we're making a game. And it's, make the player go to some other place and that other place feels new. But even before we go to another place, when I think about contrast in the environment, what mark does the player leave on the world? So this is the dead bodies that we talked about before. What can I change in the environment that the player already inhabits? How can I take this one world or this one room and make it feel different, make it feel unique? Where else can the player go? How do they get there? Why? And I really try to focus on real environments familiar to the player. When I'm trying to add contrast for an environment, I want to key into things that people already know about, that the player's already going to be familiar with, so that way when they see it, they can be like, that's a bedroom, I get it. So if you've ever played a game that was like on a space station, and you're just going down hallway after hallway with just pipes lining the wall, and you're kind of like, this feels kind of all the same. That's what I try to avoid by leaning on familiar environments for the player. And then you need to sell your environment changes. How are you getting to a new place? I really like Unity, and one of the things I got from it was amplified color, which let me have like this overlay I could put over my screen. So I could have this kind of sterile, cold overlay, then I would have this dark, moody overlay, then I have this green overlay, because green's very pretty. But just by having those kind of ways to shuffle it up, you could visit a new room and suddenly it feels strikingly different. You could be going through this moody cavern and then you get into this spooky, cold, sterile tomb. And immediately the player is going to feel that contrast. They're going to feel like they're in a new place. So how is contrast conveyed for environments? Furniture backgrounds change, people change, music changes, lighting changes, overlays change, often a combination of these. And when I talk about adding this contrast, I want to say that it's more than just variety, because variety a lot of times is the same thing repeated in a new pattern. But we really want contrast to be building on your earlier design, and it's creating this new point for people to compare that earlier design to. It has to be a big enough shift that it feels new, and contrast has to have context, and it also has to have symbolism. So at the beginning I said no one knows how to make design games, and this is good proof that I'm a liar there, because this game is just beautiful, and this was designed in the early 80s. And if you think about it, in terms of contrast, what's different between these two screens? First off, blue, pretty background, dark, moody, walls to the side, wide open sky, the different music that plays. And if it would just stop there, that would be probably good enough. You have this, above ground world, you've got this underground world, you've got contrast, you've got these two different things going on. But they go a step further by drawing the line between the two. You go into this pipe and you don't come up the top, so you have to go down the pipe. And they've gone, instead of having 2 levels, they've created a world. So now it's not, I'm above ground, I'm below ground. Now it's this whole cohesive world that's all stitched together, and it's so much more believable because of that. And that's really what I want to talk about when I talk about contrast, is building these complex worlds that are tied together, and it creates this varied environment for the player to explore. Why does this all work? This is from the Tao Te Ching. We know beauty because there is ugly. We know good because there is evil. Being and not being, having and not having create each other. Difficult and easy, long and short, high and low define each other, just as before and after follow each other. The only reason we have the notion of beauty in our world is because we have the ugly. So when we apply these kinds of principles to designing games, it's going to make a game that's going to have a lot more in common with our real world. Kind of tying into this, if we always had rainbows, rainbows wouldn't be special. We would be bored with rainbows. We would not look up at the sky. But the fact that we have dark thunderstorms and then we have beautiful rainbows, that makes the rainbow that much more beautiful. And when we apply that to the game, have moments of darkness, have moments of light, it makes the game feel closer to our real life, and it gives those moments of light that much more power. So the second level of contrast is player interaction. The first one, we're talking about the things around the player. Now we're going to talk about what the player is actually doing in the world. So how can we change the way the player approaches the game? I like to think of it in terms of changing their pace. Maybe they get hurt, maybe they get powered, maybe they need to be stealthy, maybe they need to be fearless. We can change their verbs. One of the things I did with Last Ditch Goodnight was you had weapons you would find, and then I wanted it to be more than just hitting things, so those weapons also solve puzzles as you go. So you have to have a weapon that's going to, the screwdriver will let you unscrew things later on, the sword will let you slice open things as needed. And it just creates a little bit more of a robust world. Always keep world building in mind. Whatever the player does, what happens when they can't do it? When they can do it really well, when they don't need to do it. And whenever I'm designing my games, and if I feel like I'm getting in a rut, that I'm just not doing anything new or interesting with it yet, if I go to those kind of questions, it helps me give it a little bit more juice. It helps me inject it with a little bit more design ideas. Metal Gear Solid, you get in a box and you crawl around. That would be weird, but up to this point you've been kind of skirting around the edges, avoiding enemies. Now suddenly you have this thing that lets you crawl into the middle of the world and be relatively safe. So you have those 2 points, kind of going back to this notion of contrast as 2 points with comparison. Here I can't run into the middle, here I can run into the middle. Now that I can compare these two though, this is that much more thrilling because I feel like I'm exposed. I know I'm kind of safe, but I feel like I'm in the middle of everything and I'm going to get hurt, and this is exciting because I'm kind of safe, I think. And just kind of building on that for a player makes it even more exciting for them because now they knew what it was like to not have it, now they know what it's like to have it. And really why that works is that brains and developers lie. So here we have the mantis shrimp. It has 12 color receptors, and we only have 3. So in terms of contrast, there's your 2 points. We have 3 color receptors, they have 12 color receptors. They can see 4 times as many colors as us. They have the potential to. Now when I tell you that, your brain can start filling in the gaps between 3 and 12. Like they can see the purpliest purple that has ever purpled. Or like they can see like teal, not like teal, but like teal. And you know, automatically they are that much more impressive for it. Like that is an amazing animal now. I can't show you what colors they can see, but by knowing that, your brain fills in the gaps. And we do the same things when we do game design. When we have good contrast, when we have 2 points, even then, you know, before we had him sneaking around in a box, or he's running. Even though he only has those 2 states, being sneaky or running, by giving players those 2 states that are drastically different, their brains are going to fill in the gaps between all the rest of them, and it's going to feel like a full world. Even though, like, if we were running in the real world, we could change our speed anywhere from standing still to a full-blown run. In games, it's usually one or the other, but by giving them those 2 points to compare, it makes it feel like they're more in control. Let the brain fill in the rest. The world fills in everything, feels like it allows everything in between. Suspend all that disbelief by giving a world they can live in. And that's really our big goal, is to suspend all that disbelief. In terms of my own design, I like to think of it as entertaining my friends. For the gamer, the person playing your game, you are the arch nemesis and the savior. Because making games, 75% of game design is building obstacles and then giving people tools to get around those obstacles. So I like to introduce obstacles that create player interaction. The 2 I have here, one is darkness, which impeded speed. The problem was, if it was dark and I had this really dark, moody world, people would run through it and then they'd run right into enemies that they couldn't see because they were in the darkness. So I changed it. Now you can't run if it's dark. You have to walk. It kind of slows the pace down. But then later on, I give them this torch. I'm suddenly the good guy now. So even though I was the one who slowed them down before, now I get to be the savior who gives them the torch that now it lights up the room enough that they can get through it. Same thing before, there was laser beams that would come down, you'd have to wait till you can get through. But then later on, you get the security badge and they just turn off for you so you can run through them. So now contrast level 3 is player movement. The first one is the world around the avatar. Second one is changing what the avatar does. Third one is changing the person interacting with the game, changing how they handle the controls on the game. And there's a very good chance, like any of your favorite games, they probably key into this. The avatar is an extension of the player itself, so give the body itself enhancements. Force players to learn new modified control schemes. New jumps, dashes, flips, wall runs, transformation of the player into something else. Give vehicles with new controls. Add a world map with camera changes, jetpacks, hang gliders, grappling hooks, Pegasus boots. Distance yourself from other games in your genre. When you have that big of a shift, it's so easy to notice for the player and to feel like they're almost getting a new game in it. You know, Halo, you'd run around shooting things with a gun, and then suddenly you'd find a car, the Warthog, and it felt completely different when you found it. Like suddenly it felt like a completely different game. And when I first started designing games, that irritated me because to me, it was like, they made 2 games, that's cheating. You can't just make 2 games and stitch them together. That's twice as much work, I can't even begin to approach that. But if you think about it, I mean, it's still the exact same physics engine. It's just, you know, slightly different camera on it. The worlds are a little bit bigger, but less detailed. And by just doing that, though, and then completely changing the control scheme, it does feel like a completely separate second game that you get with it. So I really try to focus for Last Ditch Goodnight is I focused on the player's relationship with their controls. Directional direct control was running. Button press did a body shot, so you kind of did a dash forward. Button held accelerated movement, so if you held down a button later on, you get another perk that lets you fly. And the cool thing about this is it's so easy to test if what you've done with your contrast. So, you know, contrasting, dashing around to walking around, it's so easy to tell if it works. Because whenever, every time I try to fix my game, I make myself play 100% playthrough just to make sure nothing else got, you know, terribly broken during that. And whenever I play through it then, I immediately get irritated that I can't dash yet because it's so much fun to just dash around with that. And so there's the part of my brain that's like, well, I should just make the game nothing but dashing. Of course, that's the fun part. But if I ever do that, then I lose the contrast. I don't feel the freedom of dashing because there's no walk to compare it to. So why is this so important to me? Why do I keep talking about contrast as these two different points to compare? Every time we make games, we're chasing these two graphs, power over time and intensity over time. And really what this is saying is that when you add contrast to a game, when you add a strong juxtaposition to an earlier moment of the game, you're taking control over these two graphs. And that's the best thing we could ever hope for as game designers, is to take control over these two graphs. So it's going to cause an abrupt change with no subtlety. When there's good, strong contrast, it's not this slow, subtle thing. It's not slowly getting more powerful. It's like suddenly something is crazy different, and people have to notice it. And also, we're trying to create these excitement peaks. When we try to make excitement peaks in our game, the first one is difficulty, but that's really hard to tune because some people might have an easier time on one thing, other people might have an easier time on another thing. It's hard to control. We should still try to do it, but it's hard to manage. Plot. A lot of my games have talking in them, and a lot of people just hit the A button to get through the talking so they can get back to hitting things. Which I can understand, but it makes it hard to really kind of control the emotional roller coaster that I want them to be on. But when you have contrast, when they enter a room and it's completely different, when they get a new power-up that makes them control the game completely differently, they have to take notice of it. And when they get it, they get a little bit excited about it, and then they kind of get used to it, and then, okay, it's starting to get a little boring, and then you give them something new, and they get excited about it again. And kind of going back to the Halo example, it's so wonderfully tuned that it's, by the time you're starting to get bored driving around the car, okay, well now you need to get out of the car for a while. And then you get bored running around, okay, well now you need to get into a car again. And just having those 2 points to shift you back and forth between, it makes it feel exciting every time you get it. And you get to ride the intensity roller coaster. It's really easy for this kind of a talk to come off as just add more game to your game and it'll be more gamey. And I don't want it to be that way. So I want to say that, why don't we just add more game? And it's more than just adding game. Variety can mask contrast. We're told to just ship it and learn. But I still like to, whenever time I'm making a game and I feel like I'm getting stuck, or I feel like I'm getting close to the end and I'm wondering, is it enough? I like to say, never be satisfied until you've made a world, not a game. When you go to add new content, always ask yourself, are you adding contrast or are you adding variety? Are you adding something that's a little bit different, but it's kind of the same thing? Or are you adding something that the player's going to notice, that the player's going to feel in their heart? Are your worlds repetitive? How can you flesh out your world with a new, meaningful environment? How can you connect to new places? Does the player do the same thing the whole game? What new obstacles can you put in their way to change that? And how can the player move in a new way? And really, if you start breaking it down across those things, how am I going to change the world they're in so that they'll notice? How will I change what they're doing in the world? Even using the same controls, but just superpowering the controls, weakening the controls, doing something with it, or making them actually interact with the physical sense really different. It's worthwhile, and it can make the game that much more exciting. And again, like I said, this is a talk that if it does come off as just add more game, this isn't something actionable. If you don't like that, here's just 4 random things that I kind of swear by otherwise. So if the rest of this talk was boring, at least you can do these things. Make a prepare for release script button that clears all your debug switches. So every time you go to production, you hit that and you make it so that the player isn't invincible anymore, and then you'll get to sleep at night. So that's nice. Never trust players to have their darkness settings perfect. Google object pooling. And if you ever really need just cheap, pretty animation, just scaling, more on X, less on Y, or more on Y, less on X is the cheapest, best animation juice you can ever hope for, and it just makes your whole world feel springy. And that is my talk on contrasting game design. Thank you, guys.
And next we have Adam. Pastor.
If you want to stretch for a bit before we keep this off. This thing is like in the middle of the screen. It doesn't matter if it's tilted down or up.
Last one.
So that means next. Center button. Yeah, center button is. Doesn't seem to show this one right. So it's kind of counterintuitive. Where's the? I'm missing so much.
Everybody ready? So for this last talk, to kind of close out this night, I'm gonna try to make you think a bunch. So I hope that's okay. I know it's kind of late, but I promise if you make it out to the other side successfully, it's gonna be really good. So going through this myself to put this talk together, all the research required changed a lot of the way that I actually perceive the world. So I'm not guaranteeing I'm gonna do that for you, but that's the goal. So I'm Adam Koster. I'm from Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm one of the co-founders. We'll talk more about me later, but not too much. And again, I'm here to talk about thinking. More specifically, I want to talk about decision making. Because decisions are actually how we think. So thinking is just a sequence of decisions back to back.
Can you speak up, please?
Oh yeah, sure.
Thank you.
So decisions are how we think. We make decisions constantly, all the time, mostly without even being aware that we're doing that. So in our day-to-day lives, we're probably making, I don't know, some enormous number of decisions, and again, most of them are underneath your conscious. You're not even aware that it's happening. So while you're driving, you're making decisions all the time about what to do to keep from getting in an accident. When you walk into this room to choose a seat, there were lots of cues that were both conscious and subconscious that directed you where you were more comfortable sitting. Right? No matter what you do, you're being guided by decisions, and again, many of those are implicit. But what's a decision anyway? Decisions are just how we deal with uncertainty. These are just kind of two sides of the same coin. The world around us is uncertain. It presents us with many options at all times, and decisions are just the process that we use to navigate the uncertainty of the world. This also means that uncertainty and decision making is what makes things interesting. If we didn't have any decisions to make, if we didn't have uncertainty, we wouldn't be who we are, because those decisions and the uncertainties that we have all faced are what have made us who we are today. It's what has brought us all into this room together tonight, is this long sequence of decisions that we made leading up until now. So that really they make us who we are. So this is something that kind of leads to an interesting paradox, at least for me, which is that while uncertainty and then decision making in the face of it is both the interesting part of life and the thing that sort of defines us as human beings, we mostly try to avoid it. We mostly seek certainty, and we actually have a really large love for and a large respect for perceived certainty, to the extent that somebody can convince us to do something just by seeming certain about it. We tend to gravitate towards people who express beliefs with high certainty. We tend to avoid people who seem to be uncertain about stuff. And anytime we feel uncertain about stuff, we tend to feel bad about that fact. So this is interesting, right? Because if uncertainty is where all the fun is, why do we want certainty so much? There's a problem with certainty, which is that certainty is lazy. And at the end of this talk, we're going to kind of round this off and explain really why. But the main gist of it is that certainty pretends that hard decisions are easy decisions. Because there are no easy decisions. And that's what this talk is all about. So I'm going to start off with an example. We're going to come back to this example later on of what looks like an easy decision. So anyone who has played Tetris has an automatic gut response to this, excuse me, of where you would want to put this block. So the decision I'm putting forth to you is put this block somewhere. For those who aren't familiar with Tetris, you can put it anywhere on this thing down here. The goal in Tetris is to, as new pieces come down, to fill up the space without leaving any gaps on any row. So again, the question, where to put this? So you'll come up with a decision. Some of you who might be unfamiliar will have just said, I don't know, and then decided not to decide. Those of you who play a lot of Tetris will have decided exactly where to put it, and I bet I know where. We'll come back to that later. But do you know why? Do you know how you made that decision? If you work backwards, you're going to start applying all kinds of rationales that explain why you made that great choice that you made, right? But did any of those really happen? Your brain did something automatic. It made a sequence of steps that produced a decision about what to do with this block. And you weren't even aware of that happening. The question is, what did your brain do? So decisions are not easy. There are no easy decisions. Even a seemingly simple decision actually has a whole bunch of stuff hidden behind the scenes, which is what we're going to get into. So back to certainty. Certainty is lazy, so it also pretends that intuitive decisions are better than conscious ones. This is sort of a general thing that we are taught for our entire lives, basically, which is that you should, speak from the heart and think with your gut. And these are good ways to deal with problems. These are things that are respected. But what intuitive decisions are cheap decisions. And there's a good reason for this. This isn't to say they're bad. They're cheap. They have a low cost. And this is because we are faced with so many decisions all day, every day, that we can't afford to expend enormous amounts of conscious energy processing all of those different decisions that have to be made. We need really fast, really cheap automated systems to do this. That's what intuition is. Intuition seeks patterns. Intuition looks at the current situation you're facing, digs through its memory banks to find a similar situation that seems metaphorically roughly the same, and then applies whatever it did then to what it's doing now. But it doesn't actually sit back and evaluate, are these really the same situation? Was that even a good decision I made the last time? It doesn't do that. But it feels really good to make an intuitive decision because it needs to, because we need to make lots of intuitive decisions all the time. But this is a problem when we want to make very careful, deliberate decisions about important things. Because the reason that intuition works is also the same reason that it falls apart when it's most important. Intuition comes from a collection of biases. There's an enormous list of them. I just put a few of the fun, common ones up here. If you've never dug into cognitive biases, I encourage you to go Google and go down the Wikipedia rabbit hole because it's really interesting and it'll teach you how your brain works. But there's nothing wrong with these, right? These are always presented in arguments and things where people say, oh, you're just using a confirmation bias here, right? You've messed up in your logic, you've done something wrong. But no, you've just done what your brain does automatically, what it does really well, and what is frankly amazing. The reason that we get to just get around the world is because our brains do all of this. What we need to be able to do on top of that, though, is recognize when this has happened, when it's important, so that we can take a step back and ask, why did I make that decision? Should I have made a different one? So here's the goal of today's talk. Because intuition is cheap and is automatic, my hope is that you stop trusting it. That doesn't mean stop using it because you need it, but it means stop trusting it. I also want you to stop being enticed by certainty, because I'm going to argue this whole time that certainty is a bad thing. Which means, hopefully, that we can all leave here being confidently uncertain, being confident about being uncertain. So, I don't know if we can pull this off, but this is the goal. Okay, so should you believe me? I said earlier that I wasn't going to talk much about myself, and that I'm not. But there's a question here of, should you believe anything that I have to say? So I'm talking about decision making, so what do I know that's relevant to that? I did a PhD in cell molecular biology where I studied how cells make decisions. So that was years of my life just studying decision making in the context of cells. When I finished that, I joined my brothers as a co-founder at our game studio, where I focus on process improvement, which mostly means identifying problems that people are having and trying to figure out how to solve them better, which is just another form of decision making. And in preparation for this talk, I read a large stack of books about decision making, especially in the context of psychology, so that I could feel like I was kind of up to date with at least not the nitty gritty academic stuff, but at least kind of the high level stuff that summarizes what people think. But you still shouldn't believe anything I say, right? Because I'm not an expert in any of this, right? And actually, if anybody thinks they're an expert in something, you should distrust them immediately. I'm just a person who may have studied this more than most of you have, and maybe not even all of you. So what matters here is if what I say is useful. Does it seem like a useful way to think about the world? Does it seem like you can make use of the claims that I'm making and the way of thinking that I'm proposing? All right, so with that out of the way, let's actually dig into this. So when I sat down to do this talk, it was because I had realized there was a problem, which is that at work, I focus on process improvement. I focus on how do we do things better at all times whenever possible. But I realized that I never actually sat back to think, what if we take that all the way to the top and just do everything better? Because everything is just decisions, so why can't we just start there, right? So then I went down this rabbit hole of trying to address the question, what does it mean to make a decision? So as I kind of alluded to earlier from my kind of my history, this is a completely unsolved, complex problem. People are tackling it in basically any domain you can think of. It's really big in computer science and all kinds of realms, including artificial intelligence. It's really big in various aspects of biology and, of course, psychology, which is the study of just how people actually think. So I encourage you, I'll show you some books at the end of this that I encourage you to read, and I encourage you to dig into it. It's really cool, but the important point is that nobody knows. Nobody knows how to make decisions. So I'm obviously not going to tell you, because how could I know, right? What I'm going to do is show you how I try to get at this problem, because I think it's really useful, and what I learned from doing it, I think is very valuable. So I'm going to do what we always do in science, and what we should all be doing all the time when solving a problem, which is if you're confronted with something complicated, don't even try to solve it. Give up literally immediately. Invent a simple problem that's a metaphor for it. That's similar enough that you can believe that once you have solved that simpler problem, it will teach you something about that complicated problem. Because once you've done that, you can now find another problem that's maybe a little more complicated. That's a little bit better of an approximation of this. So this is how science works. It's this iterative process where we start with easy things and make them harder and harder, and with the hope that someday maybe we'll actually talk about reality. We've never done it before, and really we never will, right? But that's the goal of all of science. So that's what we're going to do today. So we're going to start with that same decision I showed you earlier, which I'm casting as just a simple decision that's not so simple that it's boring, but still simple enough that it's surprising what the outcomes are. And the goal at the end of this, hopefully, is that we'll be able to take what we've learned from processing, thinking through step by step of a simple decision, and ask, how do we generalize this? Or can we? Okay. So, earlier I showed you this, you decided where to put it, and the question was, what were the steps your brain took to get you there? That's what we're going to try to find out. None of us knows, and you won't know at the end of it either, but hopefully you'll have a better idea. Step one, and this one to me was really interesting because I didn't even realize this was a step until I had been like 40 hours into putting this talk together. Because this step is invisible. When you're confronted with a decision to make, either you realize there's a problem or you don't. When you realize there's a problem, you don't realize you've realized that. That doesn't even make any sense, right? When you haven't realized there's a problem, there's no way for you to realize that either, right? So this is an invisible step, which is actually really important. The problems that you get to see are fully dependent on your context. It's dependent on the context you're in the moment that problem presents itself to you. So what is context? Context is all the things you know, coupled with all the things you're aware of about the things you know right now when you're confronted with some problem. That also means that any two people may or may not even see a problem, which is a source of conflict in lots of relationships, right? Further, any two people might see the same problem, but see it differently because they have different context when coming to that problem. They know different things, they're aware of different things at that time. Which again, another source of conflict, people are trying to figure out what to do and trying to make decisions together. Okay, so that's step one. Step one is realize there's even a problem. Step two, discover your options. So you've identified a problem, now you try to figure out what the possible options are that you can take, right? Again, this is all very straightforward. So looking at the situation, what are your options here? So those of you who play a lot of Tetris, so you're familiar with just thinking about this, or people who think about geometry a lot, will pretty quickly say, well, there are 7 options here. Right? Imagine these falling down all the way. There are 7 options of places you can put these. But how did you know that? Like, what was it in your brain that said there are 7 things here? Depending on your context, you would have actually seen different options. And some of you might fairly argue there are actually only 4 options here, but I'm not going to go into that or talk about it. So, even further, what if we looked outside the constraints? I told you what the problem was. I defined the problem for you. I gave you the constraints, but what if you looked outside of it? Could there be more options here? This brings us to one of the core philosophies of our studio, and of just my life also, which is that there is always one option present anytime you're confronted with a decision you have to make, which is just, can we not? Can I not do this thing? Can I not make this decision? This one is always an option. Often the answer is, no, we cannot not, but this is a question you can always ask, and you should, because it makes a remarkable filter for identifying important stuff. But yeah, so that's the important point here, is that the options that you see are dependent on your context. So what is your context? So your context comes from association. So in your mind, you get basically a kind of a web of information that's all kind of moving around, right? When you're aware of something, that allows you to trigger awarenesses of things that are similar to it, because your brain works by moving across things that are metaphorically the same. So if I say, don't think of a polar bear, you've all immediately thought of a polar bear, right? And also a whole bunch of other things related to polar bears in your mind, right? I've just created a web inside of your brain of things that you can now use when you're trying to navigate options and making decisions. So this is done through association. So what does this mean? This means if you want to have more options at your disposal, you need to work on that web of association. So the web has two parts. One is just things you know, and the other part is things you know and are aware of right now. So learning is basically just being more aware, or just having more things that you know, more things that you can pull into your awareness. Then you can use collaboration in any other form of chaos, which I'm calling chaos just any outside influence that's coming in. You can use these to start moving around in your web. Just like when I suddenly said, don't think of a polar bear, right? Suddenly now all of you were. I just changed all of your semantic web that's processing information. So this is great, because if you're trying to solve a problem, all you need to do is change stuff. You just need to be around new things. You need to learn more stuff, and now you get access to more options. But you can't know that you've discovered all the options. And if we think back to this very example where I said, now you can think outside of the context I gave you and ask, can we just not even play the game? There can, at all times, be some hidden thing that you haven't thought about. And even if there's not, there's no way that you get to know that. It's impossible to know that you've discovered all options. This has a sort of a consequence, which is that even if there is a best option for this decision you're trying to make, you cannot know that you have found it. You cannot know that it's in your pool of options available to you to choose from. Which I think is a good thing. We'll talk about that later. But, so this brings us to, what do we actually do about this? So you can never know that you've exhausted all of your options. You can never know that you found the best option. There could always be another one waiting around the corner. You cannot know. So this brings us to, I think, and this was to me one of the most important kind of lessons from going through this process, which is the idea of optimal stopping. This is taken from computer science, so it's in other domains as well. The idea is there are some problems that actually can't really be solved, such as exhausting a search of some large space. And so the idea is you have to choose when to stop. This is because of this idea that options have diminishing value. I'm going to refer to this as the good enough principle, because that's what we call it in the studio, which is basically when you just say, I've done enough, like I've gone far enough. But the idea here is actually a simple one that's fairly profound, which is that if you've already got 100 options at your disposal, adding one more option, what's the probability of that one being better than all the 100 you already have? It's 1/101, right? And that gets worse and worse and worse. So every time you add a new option, the likelihood of that being the best one continues to go down, which could be fine if there were a finite number, but you don't even know if there are. It could also be fine if there wasn't a cost associated with finding your options, but there is. There's a time cost. And as any of you will know, if you sat down to brainstorm a list of something, to make a pro-con list, to do anything that required you to jot down a bunch of stuff in your associative memory about something, you can do it a bunch very quickly, and all of a sudden you're done, right? All the ones after that are now very difficult. And usually you require some sort of external stimulus, brainstorming or whatever, a change in scenery to accumulate more ideas. Every new idea comes with increasing cost, but diminishing value. So this is why you need optimal stopping. So basically what I've told you here is that in order for us to make a decision, we have to decide when to stop discovering more options. So you may notice this is an interesting problem here, right? We now have to make another decision in order to make this one decision we're trying to make. So we're going to come back to that frequently, actually. So, okay. So that was step 2, which I hope you found was a little bit more interesting than you were expecting when I first started with just list your outcomes, right? Sorry, list your options. So now we're going to list your outcomes, which is basically what would happen? What would happen if you chose each one of those options at your disposal? And so I say simulate because you don't get to know. You don't get to know what's going to happen until you've decided the thing has actually happened and you see the actual outcome. So these are simulated. This is just your best guess at what's going to happen when you choose any one of these options. So looking at our example here, if you chose any of those 7 spots, what happens next? Again, for Tetris players, let's just say, put it at the bottom right. For Tetris players, you know, well, another things that are common, right? It's going to fall down the middle, it's going to slowly fall, you have to decide where to put it. This could be any one of 7 different pieces, and it's got to go somewhere. So all of your simulated outcomes are all the different things that can happen next after you put that block down. But why stop there? We can go 2 turns from now, or 3 turns, right? And ask, well, okay, so I put my first piece down there, then if I put my second piece there, then my third piece now, I have to decide where to put that too. So we've already just in 3 pieces reached combinatorial explosion territory. This is why when people talk about the game of chess, they say, oh, it has more possible move combinations than there are atoms in the universe, right? It's because of this, because this explodes really, really fast. So what does that mean? We're predicting our future decisions because we can't know what they are. And it means we need another decision to choose an optimal stopping point to stop simulating, to stop looking more and more forward into the future. In fact, we have to make 2 decisions, because one is you have to decide how to simulate it in the first place. So all of you Tetris players just simulated it in your brains, because you played this game enough that your brain did it automatically, and you have no idea how it did it. Those of you who haven't played but are really familiar with geometry probably were moving around in your minds also, in a slower and more visual way. Those of you not familiar with either are probably very slowly cogitating through this stuff, right? Which doesn't mean there's anything wrong with your brain, you just have a different context. It doesn't allow you to process it in the same way. So even if you're doing this mentally, everyone's doing it differently. But of course, if you're a computer scientist, you can write a program to do this for you. Or if you are a statistician, you might put some math together that predicts some of this stuff for you. So you get to choose. And you have to make 2 choices to simulate your outcomes. Okay, so we have realized there's a problem. We have delineated all of the options at our disposal. We have simulated what will happen with each of those possible options. So now we need to choose from among them, right? Which means we need a goal. We need a thing we're trying to accomplish with this decision. So what makes a goal reasonable? How do we actually choose that? So a goal is going to be guided by the options that you've uncovered, which means any 2 people who uncover different sets of options will actually have different goals at their disposal, as well as the outcomes that you simulated. So if you chose different outcomes, different simulation methods, different stopping points, you may have a different set of goals. And finally, your actual context, which just says, what do you actually even care about right now? So if you are a statistician writing a dissertation on all the things that can happen in Tetris, you might have a very different set of goals here than somebody playing this on the toilet. So importantly, there's no right goal. There's a goal that makes sense given your context and what you've come up with so far. So this is yet another decision that you have to make. So let's just choose one just to kind of get it out of the way. So let's just say the goal that I'm going to choose is to make it so that my next move is as easy as possible. That's how I'm going to position this, and I think intuitively that's what our brains are doing for those of us who play a lot of Tetris. So which place is that? We need to find out somehow, right? We need a ranking system. We need a way to say, given all of the outcomes and given our goal, how close does each one actually come to that? You need a way to measure that. Because otherwise, how do you know that one outcome is better than another? You have to have some way to do it. But again, there's no one way. There's no right way. You have to decide on that. So in this case, I'm pretty sure, though I haven't actually checked it because I don't know how, that the edge is the optimal place for this. To me, this makes intuitive sense, which means I also don't trust it. But it also feels like all of my possible next moves have to be easier because there's just more space. You know, like, feels good, right? But so that, for me, that was my ranking system. My ranking system was how much open space do I have left? That doesn't mean it's even a good ranking system. That's the one that I have access to that feels like it makes sense to me, right? But somebody else planning maybe 100 steps in the future using a statistical method in a supercomputer might say, oh, actually the middle is better on average given infinite games of Tetris. So I don't know. Seemed right, right? But here we're left with an interesting problem. Which edge do I put it on? These edges are the same because Tetris is a symmetrical game. So how do I decide here? Now I have a ranking system, and no matter what my ranking system is, if it's based on anything interesting, it's going to say these are the same. So now how do I choose? And this was another important lesson that again, I just hadn't thought about until I sat down to do this, that is enormously valuable, which is when it doesn't matter what you choose, it doesn't matter how you choose. It just doesn't matter. You just need some way to choose. And so this is really important if you're like in a grocery store, trying to choose between two things, you're like, I just don't know which one of these is better. You have no way to know. You can't know. You just need some sort of a system. So I think my favorite example of this is my brother Seth used to run a World of Warcraft guild, and anytime they were in a dungeon, their rule was always go left. Just always go left. If you hit a fork in the road, go left. Why? Not because that was a good decision, but because you need to go a direction. You can't know ahead of time which direction is better. They're equal to you. So just have a system, have a rule. The beauty of this is if you apply this to your everyday life, if you apply this to work, it cuts down an enormous amount of anxiety because a lot of the decisions that we struggle with are these ones, the ones where we don't know whether something is better than the other. If that's true, it's because either we have a bad ranking system, or actually it's basically the only possible option, right? We have a bad ranking system, which is either something we need to fix, have a better ranking system, or something we can't fix. And so you just need a new way to make a decision. And you get to choose it, flip a coin, doesn't matter. Okay, so we made it to the end. This is now the model summary of what we came up with, built off of a simple decision, simple quote unquote, which goes like this. So first, we're going to define the problem. Being able to even see it depends on the context. How you define it depends on your context. Next, we're going to discover all of the options that we have at our disposal. So we can't find them all, it's impossible, and we wouldn't want to because that's too costly. So you need a way to stop. You need a way to stop it and call something good enough. We need a way to simulate outcomes. And so you need to choose how you're going to do it. Usually this is just being done in your brain. And again, we need to be able to stop it good enough. At some point you have to stop looking forward into the future. Then we need to choose a goal and choose a ranking method so that we can actually check our outcomes against that goal. Then just take the best one. And in the case of ties, choose randomly, it doesn't matter. Okay, so this is what I came up with after going through this step-by-step process of decision making. Now, a lot of you are probably thinking, I don't think this is really how it works. Like, why choose a goal there instead of maybe at the beginning? Or really actually almost anywhere in this position. Also, I don't usually identify the entire problem and then go through this process. I go through a piece of the process, identify new things, refine the problem, and go back through again. Right? That's because of this. So I presented a purposely simplified view of how this works, because again, it's convenient. It actually gets to teach us something. I got to learn personally a few lessons that I got to convey to you in doing it, but that doesn't mean we actually learned how it works. It means we learned useful aspects of how it works that we can actually take advantage of. This is closer to the truth, right? Probably, but also still not true. This is an approximation. So the idea here is that actually, yeah, you can choose a goal at any time. You can change your goal at any time, depending on what your problem is. Because the key to all of this is context. Every time you do anything in here, your context changes. Every time your context changes, it changes the options available to you. It changes the problems that you get to see. It changes how you see your ranking system, right? So every time anything in your brain changes, your context is now different. Decision making is there's a series of steps that are changing your brain, which means this is even one step more complicated than this, because this whole pattern needs an optimal stopping point, right? When you sit down to make a decision, this is what your brain is doing, at least approximately, right? You need some way to say, okay, I think I've done enough, right? I've chosen something, and I think I need to move forward now. The point of all this is that, again, in the same way that just for discovering your options, you can't find the best one because there isn't one. It's the same deal with making a decision as a whole. You don't get to make the best decision. It's not available to you, right? And again, it would be so costly to do that that you wouldn't want to, because you have other decisions to make. You can recover from a bad decision because you have infinitely more ahead of you. Okay, so what have we learned? Like I said, there is no best decision, but this is a freedom, right? This doesn't mean that now you have to be worried because you're never going to have the best one. This means nobody gets to have the best one. Nobody ever does. Nobody ever has. You're just free from that. It takes a little bit of adjustment, but you're free from that idea. You don't have to have the best solution because you get to embrace early stopping. Embrace the good enough principle so that you can just make a decision and move on with your life. Your goal obviously is still to make a good decision, right? To make the best among the options at your disposal and find as many good options as you can within a reasonable cost and time frame. But again, the goal is not to find the best solution. This also means that decisions are only good or bad in retrospect because you can't know the outcome of a decision until you've made it and the outcome has happened. So presumably you're doing the best you can and trying to make a good decision, right? In that case, something will happen now. Once that thing happens, it's going to teach you, it's going to provide context that you didn't have when you made that decision. So it will tell you in retrospect that that was a bad or a good decision, which now you just get to learn from. It's not a judgment, right? It doesn't change anything about how you made that decision. It's just an opportunity to learn. And some of the things you might learn be about how you make decisions, which is great. Now you get to apply that to every future decision you make for the rest of the time. This also means if you're stuck, if you're trying to make a decision and just can't quite, if you're just stuck on it, just add associations to it, right? Try some random stuff to kickstart this loop. Like inserting something into somebody else's brain or having them insert something into your brain just by having a discussion. That's going to change what becomes available to you, changes your context, and makes you able to identify new things and make new, different decisions. And if you're really stuck, like you're stuck with multiple options that all seem to be the same, just be dumber. Choose one at random. Always go left. Doesn't matter. Do something, right? But you just get to make that decision and just move on. So I was trying to, as I was doing this, kind of looking at this model, I was trying to think of how certainty fits in with this. Because obviously when you look at that, when you look at how much of a recursive, iterative, infinite spaghetti this thing is, this process of making a decision, it seems completely absurd that anybody would be confident about something. That anybody would be certain about something, right? It just doesn't make any sense. So I was trying to decide, how does this fit in with this model? And the best I could come up with for now is that certainty to me seems to be having chosen a ranking system that just doesn't care what your options are, right? So now if that option is on the table, that's the one you pick because it just gets top billing. Which goes right back to the very beginning when I said certainty is lazy. So what else have we learned? No one else knows what they're doing. They can't know. So if you ever feel like you're kind of swimming around and like everybody seems to have their stuff together and you just don't, nobody does, right? You can't. It's impossible. All you can do is just the best you can and keep learning from the things that you've done, retrospectively. And importantly, this puts all the control back on you, which is a big responsibility, but is also, again, very uplifting and freeing, right? Because you're the person closest to the problem you're solving right now. You're the one with the context, especially when they're your problems. So that means you're the one who has the most information that they can use in this decision-making machine. And so it's all on you. You don't need to look outside, right? Though you can use that to kickstart your associative understanding of the world, but it's all on you. You get to make that decision. So here's sort of the summary. My goal was to say, look, thinking is super hard. Like we all know that. As a scientist, a lot of how I approach any kind of problems that I face is by trying to understand them more deeply, because I believe that by understanding a thing, you take its power away, and you get to keep it for yourself. So my goal here is to show you, hopefully, why. And not like all of why, right? But to give you kind of a glimpse into why it is that thinking and making decisions and all of us just moving ahead in life is difficult. It is difficult. And if anyone tells you otherwise, they're clearly wrong, right? It's a difficult process. So So our brains are lazy and biased. But here we are, right? It's amazing. So if you just think a little bit, if you just like sit back and just ask, like, how do I do this better? If I sit down and actually think about something instead of just letting my brain automatically do it for me, you're probably going to do better. And you're already doing fine, right? So there's just nothing to worry about here. So, which is all to say that I hope that everybody can learn to embrace uncertainty instead of fearing it, because uncertainty, again, is where all the fun is. It's what lets you control your life and be who you are. So that should allow you to hopefully be confidently uncertain. So with that, I think I'm not having any questions, but we'll deal with that afterwards. But we have some more talks up on the internet. Seth has one that's much more uplifting than this one, probably, so that'll be a good one to check out. And we talk about this stuff on our podcast a lot, so if you're interested in diving deeper, do that. These are sort of the core books that I drew from for a lot of what I presented here. And they're super good. They are easily accessible no matter what your academic background is or what your focus is on. And so I can't recommend enough reading those books because for me anyway, they changed how I see the world, and I hope that they'll do the same for you. And so that's all I got. Thanks.
We have loads of time. So if the other two speakers want to go ahead and go up, and then we can do questions.
Hey, friendos. What's up?
I really hope at least one person.
Yeah, that's good. Bring up in front of the
Gadget and swear.
Yep.
You're gonna pose.
So when it comes to decision making and thinking, like how and when and to what extent do you defend a decision?
Literally never. And if you think I'm joking, talk to my brothers. Because the goal of decision making is to collaboratively discover a good path forward. And I never make the assumption that I've found the best path for all these reasons, right? And so if I have made a decision about something, then if it hasn't come to pass yet, then I'm always open to changing that decision. And so I don't defend it, but I will discuss all the reasons why. Right? There's an important distinction there. And once it's come to pass, I'll never defend it. Because now that was a thing I got to learn from, right? And whether it was good or bad is just, it's not up to me. That's how the cards fell, right? And so I just look back at that stuff and just try to understand how it turned out. And when I'm talking about it with other people, we try to understand why that was the outcome that it was, without defending the choices that led us to that outcome. If that makes sense.
I think so. Kind of stew on that for a little bit, but yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Awesome.
Artist person, what's your name again?
Jillian. Hey.
Do you have any immediate advice for recent graduates seeking to join the industry but don't necessarily have a portfolio fully ready?
Yeah, so one of the best things you can do is if you're looking to work in a specific work environment, the biggest, most obvious one would probably be modeling a portfolio project to what that company does. Even if you just set up your own personal projects, even if the stuff that you've made in school doesn't necessarily fit it, kind of take that as your base. Maybe some of them you can even rework and redo to better fit the portfolio you want to be working on. But I would be looking at whether you go on LinkedIn or Twitter or something, find people that work at that place or maybe used to work there or do work that's similar and see what's in their portfolio and kind of get a gauge for the work that they may have gotten hired by, and then kind of build up from there. That would be probably one of the easiest ways in terms of without having to travel to places or necessarily networking or something. That's something you can immediately do on your own that will also just personally improve your skill set a lot. And then secondly, just it's great to be in touch with people in the community, being involved in different conversations and stuff. If you can, go to different conferences and that sort of thing, get a feel for what's trending in the industry and that sort of thing. So, yeah.
Who's picking? Anybody? Just anybody?
Who's the picker? Who's the picker?
I think, yeah, I just want to say, I feel like you guys gave the same talk from 3 completely different directions.
Everybody gets sad.
No one knows what they're doing.
Very inspirational. But basically, the message that I took away from everybody, sort of collectively, was the idea of you can't know everything. That's okay, and you just have to keep iterating and just keep moving forward and learn from the things that you've done in the past. So I think that's just a nice coincidence.
All the same vibes. Yeah. Sweet. You have a question again? What is it?
Yeah. So Ben, so this idea of contrast and variety. So how, if it's possible, like, do you determine like a good level of contrast? What's too much? Like kind of like where the happy medium is, if it exists, and the balance between contrast and variety.
I'd say as long as you can sell yourself that these two things exist in the same world, I don't think the points can be ever too far apart because the brain just can fill in anything in the middle. I think the hard part is connecting those 2 points and showing that those are related. I think variety, a good example of that is I have a fire level, I have an ice level, I have, when you start thinking in terms of those core concepts, you need something that brings them all together. Why am I visiting an ice level? Why am I visiting a fire level? And I think when you start trying to tie these worlds together, have the Mario pipe that connects the 2 things together. When you start thinking in terms of that, it starts bringing the points a little bit closer together because now they have to exist in the same ecosphere. But yeah, as long as you can have 2 points and as long as you can get the people to believe that they are connected to each other, I say, yeah, you push it as far as you can.
From the stream, Ben,
Yep.
in your experience, do you think it's more difficult to pull off a contrast that is not as obvious as your example of above/underground, an example of Super Mario Bros? Or can shifts in less obvious literal ways be easier?
I think it's definitely easier. I guess I'd say when you need to be careful with the word shifts because if you try to be subtle, people don't pick up on subtlety ever. So you kind of need to be a little bit more overt and a little bit more, heavy-handed in showing you're at this new place, here's how you got there, or you've got this new thing, here's how you got there. I'm not sure if I'm answering that quite right, but I'd say there's middle ground, but you always just have to challenge yourself if you really want to stand out. And I think that's what we're all trying to do is, we're trying to express ourselves in a meaningful way and have people actually pick up on it.
Jillian, would you say in your freelance career there was a watershed moment where you felt that things were moving along nicely, or was it all just fits and starts, or how would you describe that?
Never. I think the biggest thing is my partner and I are both illustrators, and we kind of focus in different areas of illustration. And I think even kind of the hallmark of kind of editorial-based illustration is getting into something like an American Illustration Annual. That's one of the big peaks of your career. It's really great if you can get a medal. If you're in other things, maybe it's getting a children's book assignment or something. Even when you reach those points, even if you happen to get that medal or you happen to get a big illustration contract or something, you're still vulnerable to a couple months of not doing anything, or maybe that year your illustration style isn't in trend or something. So I don't think I think I've had a lot of really great moments with my personal freelance, and I think I've gotten into a good rhythm personally, and I think that's something that each person has to individually work towards to find what works for them in their marketing and outreach and their work process. I'd say I'm in a good personal spot. I always want to strive and do more things, but the key thing is just keeping that balance between steady work and satisfying personal projects and not getting overwhelmed by not having work or not being satisfied with my personal project. So it's always a continuous battle. Anything else? Anyone?
I got one.
Yeah.
This is kind of for both of you guys. For me, especially with like art and stuff, and thinking in terms of decision making, for me the hardest thing is knowing when to stop, when I'm finished making something, especially when it comes to art. So what would your guys' metrics be? How would you gauge, or what would be some of those questions you'd be asking to evaluate if you've hit the end state or if you need to keep going?
Mine is always to repeatedly and always come back to the question of what is this for, and who is it for, and we try to, like I said, I try to err on the lazy side because there's always infinitely more stuff to do, right? So for me, the question isn't like how do I get as close to perfection as possible. It's how do I get as close to bad as possible, right? Where it's just good enough that it is going to reach the threshold that I need it to for whatever the purpose is. Because once it's hit that point, I got other stuff to do, right? So go on and do that stuff instead. So I don't ever look at it based on what I think is important. It's always on what the purpose is and the user of that thing and what they're going to think is important.
I think one of the biggest tenets from like a visual design standpoint is finished, not perfect. Like you were saying, what is the purpose of this image for, project for, is a huge factor. If I'm at, stuff at Graphite Lab, like we have a very strict deadline, so it gets to a point where, I could spend weeks really fleshing something out and making beautiful animations and doing this stuff, but, there has to be a point where it has to be delivered. But even within my personal work, there's just kind of an end understanding of what I wanted for that image to begin with. I understood from the get-go with my sketch what kind of mood I wanted, what story I wanted to tell, and when I get to that point where I feel like those have been met, then that's where I just kind of like step away. And even at points where I'm maybe not 100% sure if I'm complete or not, that's usually when I give it like a day rest to kind of step back and see if I actually am done or not, and then I can kind of go from there. But yeah. What about you? Do you?
I just keep going.
You just keep
Infinite, just forever.
Forever.
But no, it's a lot of that. And I think that hit close to home what you said at the end of taking a step back and letting it just sit for a day or two and then come back to it and say, am I noticing something glaringly obvious missing now that I've had time to think about it, or am I still pretty happy with it? So I think that's probably what I need to do.
Yeah. Cool.
Should we just mingle or finish?
Mingle. Wes wanted to say some stuff.
Well, I have a question. Maybe.
Wes has a question.
I don't know. This is the stuff that I assumed over while you were talking, and I don't know if it applies. But I feel like based on the podcast and stuff like that, you have an opinion. So here it is. As I get older, I make a lot of decisions without realizing they come from like years of context. And I'm a lead on the team of mostly younger people right now, and I forget that I haven't shared the context with people.
Yep.
And people seem to resent sometimes that I get my way without like explaining that. So one of the things I do is I say YOLO when I see things heading for a place where we're just going to overthink it and just come up with the same solution. Basically, like this early stopping is YOLO in my brain. But doing things like this, like early stopping and not actually like opening up for discussion, keeps people from failing and learning from it. Or spending time overthinking it.
It shouldn't. You should still be failing basically nonstop. So this doesn't prevent failure like even a little bit.
Yeah.
It just lets you fail earlier.
Fail faster.
It's less costly, right? Every failure is less costly if you spent time.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So I consider myself a pragmatic person, and when things work out, I take that as evidence that things worked out. But sometimes they work out in tangible ways, but then there's like collateral damage internally with my team, where they don't where those lack of conversations is making them feel less empowered. So do you have any tricks to look for when you're in that situation, or when it's less of a black and white thing, and all of those steps have value?
Yeah. So it never is a black and white thing. So you're just always operating in this gray zone. And the process should not at all inhibit further input and stuff, because it's not about doing this stuff in any kind of a vacuum at all. It's about understanding what the value of all the components are. So when it comes to things like bringing in other people to help inform that decision, that means they're now pooling their context with yours, right? And they are going to have different contexts. So the one you're describing comes from just experience, right? But that's not the only kind of context. It's anything that has been different about your life is now going to be additional and potentially valuable. And so I guess all I can really say is that the optimal stopping is about having decided ahead of time what your stopping metrics are, so that, and collaboratively ideally, so that when everybody stops, they all agree that was the right time. And if they don't agree, then at least they know why, like why that was the point. Because again, depending on context, if you're leading a thing, you might have more understanding of what the business's goals are, and that's going to shape where you want to stop versus somebody who might not have that context. So I guess I don't have a direct answer for that, but that's just what I got. So hopefully that's helpful.
I'd recommend telepathy.
Yeah, that works pretty well.
I still like the idea of him angrily yelling YOLO at people.
YOLO!
I have a question related to that. Is YOLO the more pop culture version of Leroy Jenkins?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah,
Yes. More abbreviation, less fried chicken. So, yeah. Cool. Anything else?
So,
I think we want to wrap up so we can
Cool.
mingle.
Yeah.
So let's
thanks again to Adam, Jillian, and Ben for coming out and talking. Thanks to Catherine for setting it up. And thanks to Riot for hosting. So I want to go a little bit deeper into the kind of announcements we made at the beginning. So first, the game jam. So does anyone here not know what a game jam is? All right. So shut up. So a game jam is a 24 to 48. Well, actually, a specific amount of time set at the beginning for how long you will take to make a game. So in St. Louis, we've done a lot of these, and it's a really good way to start like making games and just like dip your toe in and just kind of commit to learning something new and meeting a bunch of new people. So this upcoming game jam will be a scatter jam, which means we'll come together on Friday night somewhere, and we will learn the theme and kind of you'll probably have your team put together up front, but we'll learn the theme, and then everyone will go and work with their team of people that they know and trust to go work on their game, and then Sunday they'll bring their game back, and we'll all show them off in like a big kind of party. It's really fun. It's a good way to kind of just dip your toe in game creation and then jump in all the way, or just like try something new if you're already doing it. So it starts on Friday, October 13th, which is a cool date. So it will be Halloween themed in some way. We might have a costume party. We're still figuring it out. And it's going to be really fun and spooky. We will announce that, and if we have any pre-events for like team forming and anything, that'll be known also. We'll try to get that announced at least by the 13th of this month, so we have a month to plan. And the next thing is the NVIDIA computer building workshop. So this is a co-op event. You have to be a co-op member to participate in this. If you don't know what that means, go to sdogamedev.com and become a member. But it will be, basically we're going to have 3 tiers of computers, and this is all like in very, very soft stone. So I guess theoretically, if you wanted to break outside of that, come and talk to us. But it'll be like $300, $400, or $500 for the base, and then it's actually like a more expensive computer because the video card is going to be offered to you. And the event is on November 4th. It'll be at NVIDIA, and we need people between now and probably a month before the event to say, yes, I want to do it, commit, and put your money down, because we're going to buy the parts and everything, so you're all ready when you come. It does not come with Windows. That's another $100 on top of the base. But yeah, so, and it's a really good, seems like a really good computer for me. I've always bought consoles, and it's probably better than this. So, yeah.
Competition or something?
No, it's just it's actually the opposite. The goal is to, if you want to learn how to make computers, but you want someone there to help you, or you're like afraid you're gonna like set your house on fire, you can set NVIDIA on fire. Wait, I didn't say that. Yeah, so you can come and they'll walk you through it so that you don't have to like take big risks with the stuff that you want. So yeah, and the only difference in the different pricing tiers is your processor. So it's basically, just
Dual core, quad core speed.
yeah. So yeah, and if you want to do that, come and talk to us, because we have 10 slots, 5 are taken, and we need, once those 5 are taken, then it's game over. Okay, cool. And yeah, and that's all we have. So thank you very much for coming.
And feel free to stay around and be
Yeah.
for a while.
And we'll see you next week.
I want to know.